One day around the turn of the century, video game artist Marc Ericksen made a startling discovery.
I had a computer by that time. It was right around, as I say, right around year 2000.
2000, yep.
And even I had a computer then. And so I was looking at it one day and I was poking around and I, at that point I had done all the video game work that I was going to do, except for very few rare, things. And I saw a little piece of information about these are the 50 worst illustrations, ever created for gaming. And I thought, oh, wow, I did some gaming stuff. By this time I was a little bit divorced from it. It had been a while.
Right.
I didn't do nearly as many. I was still doing game art, but it was rarer, I was back to doing the standard stuff that illustrators do.
Exactly.
And so I said, I'm going to see about this, So I went ahead and went to the site. There was Mega Man 2 at the top, the absolute worst piece of video game art ever produced.
Wow.
And it was one of mine. And I was crushed, for
It's your artwork.
For about 15 minutes, and then I got pissed off. And then that began my presence online.
And that site wasn't the only one. Whenever the topic of bad box art rises from the ashes, the Blue Bomber is always mentioned. Now, most will point to the cover of the original Mega Man game as the worst offender, but Mega Man 2 runs a close second. As far as video game boxes go, they may be the least beloved 1-2 punch in gaming history. And unlike equally famous bad covers like Phalanx on the SNES, Pro Wrestling on the Master System, or Carnage Rally on the Game Boy Advance, Mega Man 2 is actually a good game. Arguably the best NES Mega Man game ever made and easily top 5 in the entire franchise. There's a piece of gold nestled within that bizarre exterior of a gun-toting blue spaceman firing a laser blast on a seemingly broken ankle. But like any art considered to be universally bad, there's always someone on the other end. A talented person attached to the legacy. On this episode of A Gamer Looks at 40, we meet Marc Ericksen, the creator of the Mega Man 2 box art. His story takes us from the shores of Vietnam to life in Silicon Valley to a career that spawned some of the most beloved video game artwork ever made and one of the most hated. Sharpen your pencils and bookmark that terrible box art listicle for another day as we explore the man behind the box of Mega Man 2, Marc Ericksen.
I was in the service for 6 years, and during that time I did a couple of tours in Vietnam and was a ranger and trainer, as well as running operations with small unit operations with indigenous teams from the various villages in certain provinces. It was pretty hairy because we were just 5-man teams, and we were on our own, kind of out in the out in the rice paddies and working that way. I really did love the service. I grew up in the service. My dad was an Air Force career Air Force officer and World War II veteran, and so it was kind of came to me through my family how I felt about about that kind of thing. So, with regard to the military, that was 6 years of from the time that I got out of high school and one semester at junior college in Sacramento, California, and it just wasn't. I wasn't geared for that at that time, and so I volunteered to go into the Army, and as it worked out, I wound up being on active service for 6 years, I guess, and it was two tours in Vietnam and as well as training in Arizona and that sort of thing. So there was quite a military period for me with regard to the idea of what I was doing and what my parameters were like. I came out of the service as basically a guy who, was very savvy as far as being an adult and being, under pressure and all of that kind of did lead to my ultimate, career, which was illustration. And, you might think that how could that really help somebody who was, who became an illustrator? Why would the military help? Well, the fact is that I had been raised to be sharp and to be on time and to be all of those military things, and that helped a great deal in dealing with what wound up being a real hectic career, as an illustrator, constantly working and being focused on 2 or 3 illustrations at a time that I had on my board, and making interacting with my clients. That was another thing that I was able to learn in the military, was how do you work with people.
Sure.
As an officer, I had to be able to work with people, work with lower ranked people, and in small team. In a small team environment, which really is not easy. You've got a 5-man team, you've got 2 officers and 3 enlisted men, and you've got to really blend well, or that kind of thing just doesn't pan out. So I kind of give my military service a lot of credit with regard to how I worked as an illustrator. Following my departure from the service was in, I guess it was 72 or so, and I was kind of at a loss about what to do, kind of, confused about where I wanted to go from after being in the service. I knew I didn't want to be in the service for a career, and I had known that all along. But what I did want to do was something I hadn't figured out, So when I got out of the service, I thought, well, really, what can you do? You've got a great record as a military guy, yada yada. But how can you function in a civilian world when all you have known from the time you were born was the military? I really never had in mind that I was going to be an illustrator. Of course, we called them commercial artists during that period, and I just couldn't imagine that I would be able to draw well enough, to be charging money for it. After I got out of the service, I realized that I didn't want to go into college for any. It wound up being the only thing that I really had, in the pan. That was really, I knew I could draw. That was it, though. And so I decided to apply to 3 art schools when I was still in the service. I was still in Vietnam, but I was pondering things because I knew there was going to be a RIF, which was a reduction in force after the end of the war for us, and I wound up thinking a lot about, while I was overseas during my last months or so before I rotated back to the States. I came to the conclusion the only thing I really had any capacity for was drawing, but I didn't know whether that drawing was going to be strong enough to be able to make a living. And I still had to learn how to be a civilian because I had been in the military for so long. I challenged myself to apply to 3 schools. And I was still in Vietnam during this period of time.
Wow.
So I contacted my dad, my father, and I asked him to send me some materials, that I had around the house from being, doing art at home and that sort of thing. So he sent me a set of cut up pieces of illustration board, very small, maybe 10 by 10 inches square. And I sat down. I was waiting for my rotation back to the States. I had about a month on my hands, and so I sat there and drew and used pencil, colored pencil, and created a kind of a lame portfolio. And then I wrapped that up and I sent that to my dad, and I asked him to send, to copy it, so that there were various versions of it, and to send those out to Pratt Institute, which was one of the schools I was looking at the time, and Art Center, which was another, and then there was the University of California, where I lived. Northern California was where my dad lived, and that's where I came back to after the end of the war. For me, and so I had this situation where I had sent these out, and all 3 of those schools accepted. Well, I take it back. 2 of the schools accepted me, which were the 2 art schools. However, the University of California rejected me because I had been a pretty mediocre student, before I got drafted. And so that's how I kind of came to be, acquainted with Art Center. And it turns out that was absolutely the best choice for me. The Art Center is a fantastic school, and it's fantastically expensive too. But I had a bonus from the RIF, a reduction in force from the military. If you were an officer on duty, they paid you a certain amount of money to let you go, because they didn't need you any longer.
Right.
And you had probably been thinking of being a career officer. Well, I wasn't really doing that. I wasn't considering being a career officer. However, I felt great about getting the money, and that allowed me to begin, my time at Art Center at school. It was, like I say, it was a very expensive proposition. As I graduated, I graduated with honors as an illustrator, and I was contacted by a group in Chicago by the name of O'Grady Graphics, and it was a very well-known company in Chicago. It was an illustration group, and it was run by a gentleman who had been a career. I take that back. It was run by a gentleman that was a veteran of the Marines in the Second World War.
Okay.
And so I went out to Chicago with my family and my wife, and we had a child by then, and we went out to Chicago, right, which is where they were located, and I picked up on the job, and I worked there for I think maybe close to a year. But I had a lot of difficulties with the owner, the guy, the ex-Marine. As I was ex-Army, he was ex-Marine.
Right.
That doesn't generally, work out very well.
Fair enough.
But I made the decision that I was going to, after, I guess it was a year, I bailed out of there and headed back to California. Okay, so then I got to California, and I didn't know squat. I don't know what California. San Francisco was not a hot locale. A lot of my friends when I was at O'Grady's, said, hey, why do you want to go to, there's nothing going on in San Francisco. There's some agencies there, but that's about I said, I really don't know. This is just something I feel good about doing. I want to go back to California.
Yeah.
I'm freezing my ass off here in in Chicago. And I'll tell you, I was hurt more being in Chicago than I was in 2 years in Vietnam. I wound up falling on the ice when I was walking from the train station, to the agency 2 or 3 times, and and hit my elbow. I mean, it was worse than a parachute drop. But anyway, so Chicago was not my thing, and so I went back to San Francisco at a time when we had no idea. This was only just brewing, the idea of technology being a technology location. And so I began illustrating small jobs, for advertising agencies and things like that, doing storyboard frames for agencies and doing various small illustration, work. And I was getting along fine. We were doing okay. We couldn't buy a house yet or anything, but we were getting by. And then what happened was, within a very short period of time, the whole thing blew up. Silicon Valley became what it was, and it just, there was just a ton of work all of a sudden.
Yeah, because you were in the epicenter of that when it started.
Yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, you're now in the midst of this big tech explosion, Silicon Valley. You're working and you're making your way, and so how did you just get into that world of video game box art? Because I just find that such an interesting leap, and it makes sense if it's you're in a tech world. Hey, that's where the works is. But is that kind of just what it was? Those were the gigs you were getting? And
well, in the beginning with the technology, I was getting work from groups that were creating the technology, and whether it be hardware or software. There was a lot of companies that were popping up, just all of a sudden.
Yeah,
and they needed to interact with the public with what they were doing. Well, what they were doing was basically creating, the web, and they were, but there were also there was a lot of hardware that was being developed that needed to be, where they were fighting with the groups were trying to outdo each other in the with regard to the hardware that they were creating. And so I wound up in the beginning doing quite a bit of cutaway work of very technical pieces of illustration for showing the interior of a number of different hardware elements. And I when I first got approached for that kind of thing, it was daunting, but I always had a lot of confidence in myself. That was very weird. I don't know why, but I felt that I could do anything. So if somebody called up and they said, "Can you do this?" I said, "Yeah."
I love it.
Even if I'd never done it. And,
why not, right?
And so I would go down to their locations, and which I was in the city, in the North Beach area of San Francisco, was where my studio was, and these guys were down. It was about maybe 45-minute, hour or so drive, something like that, and I probably made that drive 1,000 times, over the years that I was there.
Sure.
But anyway, I would, drive down to where they were. I would sit down with them, with a tech crew, and they would show me the equipment, and they would show me, tell me what it did, although it was most of that was pretty much lost on me.
Sure.
But the way I'd go at it would be to say, okay, well, so let's put this element, on a table. And I need a tech. I don't need a whole crew, but I need somebody that's going to take it apart for me. And then I got my camera set up, and I started banging away pictures, photos the unit as they disassembled it. And then, that gave me a kind of a view into the equipment, and it allowed me to imagine, how I wanted to do this as an illustration. I really, it was a very weird kind of entree to illustration, but I really felt like it was fun to do. I don't know why, but
Sure.
But cutaway stuff was what I started out with, and it really paid well. And I worked with I don't know how many tech companies, but probably about 10 or 15 different tech companies in doing cutaways for their art.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was pretty dry work if you
Right.
if you look at it that way.
Right.
But
Yeah.
what it got me down into that part of San Jose, that part of the world.
Right.
Geologic, so I was able to kind of set up these various word of mouth is real important in advertising or in in illustration. And so I got this rep as being a guy who could do the real hardcore cutaway stuff. To this day, it's hard for me to understand quite what happened, but I got a call from Broderbund, the gentleman that had put it together. He and his brother and his sister called me, and they said, we're a small company, and we're doing video games. I didn't know what video games were. But I said, "Oh, okay, that's great,"
Sure.
And they said, we'd like to talk to you, about this. I guess they felt like if I could understand technology to the point of being able to do cutaways, that I must have a reasonable imagination, I guess.
Sure.
But anyway, that was how that first developed, and I went out to their location in San Rafael, and sat down with them, and they told me what they were doing. This is what we're doing. These are games, and they're actually played by youngsters. And an illustration of what the gameplay is about.
Right.
And it was a little mystifying because I didn't know what they were talking about. And but at the same time, it was like, this is the creature, he's fighting this guy, here's his girlfriend, they're trying to get to this boat, and all this kind of stuff is going on. And I thought, wow, that I could do that. I thought I was fine doing the cutaway stuff, but this sounded like a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I started with Broderbund, and I did their first I think 3 or 4 or 5 illustrations, for their packaging, and then as the years went on, I did more work for them, but I also began my name was getting around,
right.
The gaming industry, and it was going through these fluctuations that were just wild, They would be wildly successful, and then suddenly a company would crash, and there'd be and I always got paid. That was something that I did make a point of. It was if I was going to work with a startup, I said you've got to pay me. When I bring the art to you,
right?
And I'll walk away with a check. Is that understood? And it was great. Everybody was excited.
That's great.
But at the same time, as I related to you, I didn't fit in there.
Interesting.
I did fit in there because I had a wild ass imagination, but
right.
I was an ex-military guy. These guys were far from military. I mean, it was like, holy cow, you're not even close.
Right.
And so they had all these, wildly fun images that they needed to have done.
That's so great. I love that.
Started doing it, and it began to kind of, develop as it rolled out. I got more and more calls from other groups, but working with Broadband was fantastic.
Before we continue the conversation, I just wanted to send a hearty thank you to my wonderful patrons, starting with Games with Coffee, the Let's Play Princess, Tim Knowles of The Elitist, Seth Sergel of the All In Podcast, Ryan Payne of Gamers Week Podcast, Greg Seward of the Player One Podcast and Generation 16 series of videos, Patrice Millette, BT Goebbels, Julian of Nerds Without Pants, Dan of Retrologic, and the one and only Pete Harney. If you would like to join these wonderful human beings, please go to patreon.com/agamerlooks40, check out the tiers, and sign up today if you feel so inclined. And if not, a rating or a review on your pod player of choice is just as exciting. Let's jump back into the episode. Now, when you were working with Broderbund, very quickly, did you actually get to see the game, or was it really just based off of their description of it? Again, bunch of guys saving a princess, or
No, I always saw the game.
Okay,
I mean,
so you were able to, yeah.
They were by the point they were ready to do packaging, they had the game all figured out.
Everything was done. Yes,
and so I watched the gameplay, but I didn't know how to use a computer.
Sure.
I had no computing skills.
So you just watched it and got an idea from the gameplay and created it from there? Yeah.
Always. I would sit down with one or two guys, and this is hilarious because anytime I was dealing with a lot of people that were my age or older, in the tech industry. But there were a lot of these guys that were doing various things that couldn't play the game. But they were marketing, they were marketing, but they couldn't play the game. And so I would go into the marketing guys, and they were, that was my niche when I went in. And then I would get this routine where they'd say, okay, we're going to bring in a player. Because these guys were marketing. They didn't know how to play the games. So they would bring in a kid, some 14-year-old guy,
wow.
And he or she, it was mostly he, I think. I don't know
that era.
Sexist, but it was usually a young guy. He'd come in, and these guys were sitting around in these group, these places where I was going in to pick up this work were very lavish. There was a lot of money spent on them.
Sure.
And I would realize that I'd see a lot of young men kind of sitting around at, reading and eating lunch and stuff like that. Well, these guys were the guys that they would bring over to play the game.
So interesting.
Because they didn't know how, and I didn't know how. Right. So they would bring in a young man,
young guy to do it,
and they were anywhere from 15 years old to 25 or something like that.
Yeah.
And they would play the game.
Yeah.
And then we'd watch. And of course the guys that were on the sales team already had watched it 1,000 times, but that still didn't make them players. They were in the company, but they couldn't play the games. Funny. Yeah. So anyway, that was kind of the structure. I'd go in and sit down with a team. There would be marketing there, and there would be a player. And the player would play the games, and I would look at the games, and I'd say, well, what is this, and what's going on over here? And they all had answers. This is the laser that he has when he's moving from here to here, but then he can run out of power, and so and I would say, well, what's the when he shoots, what happens? Oh, there's a big burst. Okay,
right,
all right, I got that, and that was how I connected with the technology of the games. It was through demonstration for me for each game, and of course it led to disaster with Mega Man 2.
Now, before we continue, I'd like to put the next part of the conversation in some perspective. The original Mega Man was a modest success. Maybe it was the aforementioned horrendous box art, maybe it was the lack of promotion, or maybe just bad luck. An action game and a system filled with action games. But regardless, Mega Man's first outing was less than stellar. Mega Man 2, on the other hand, was a runaway smash hit, selling 1.5 million copies, the second most successful Mega Man game of all time. But nobody knew that in 1988. By the time Marc saw the game for the very first time, it was still just the sequel to a ho-hum action game. Nobody, including the representatives from Capcom, knew quite what to make of it.
The fact is that the two guys I was talking to there, they didn't know squat about the game.
Right.
And,
right.
And so I said, well, and it was a famous pistol, I said, what's he shooting with? I'm looking at this tiny little thing. And they said, gee, I don't know. It must be he's shooting, and I said, yeah, but is he shooting with a rifle? And they said, I think so. These are the guys, from the company.
Yeah.
And I said, no. I said, okay, so you want a pistol? And the two of them looked at each other and they said, yeah, let's do a pencil.
Sure.
I mean, let's do a pencil. Well, let's do a.
Oh man.
Let's do a pistol, and
sure.
Then, that was that.
So going back a little bit to the actual creation of the artwork, you did mention that you were talking with people who didn't know the game very well either. It probably came in from Japan. You're looking at this little blue character who's shooting white dots, right? And there's not a ton of detail. And you just did the best approximation you can. How long did you have to produce the artwork?
Well, that was another thing that I had a knack for, was working rapidly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was able to, there were times when I had 2 or 3 illustrations going on at a time for 3
sure.
different clients,
Sure.
And if somebody called me and said, "Can you do this?" I would always say yes. And
awesome. Love that.
it was a grind. It became a grind. Although you can imagine all the stuff was fun.
Absolutely. You're using your imagination and yeah.
Oh yeah, the combat stuff and the new world stuff and all kinds of things, but but I never became a gamer. I never played any of the games, and I would go in and watch them be played. And that was my connection.
Mega Man 2 obviously is a huge success, sells millions of copies. It's probably in video game circles, I would say, a top 3 Mega Man game ever made. Some may say the best. It's a beloved game, which is probably why that blowback came out. But I look at that artwork just objectively as a piece of art, and I think it's pretty cool. If it was just Shooter Guy or Robot Man, I think nobody would have given it oh, that's cool, okay. But since this was attached to this beloved game, I think that's probably what happened. But you're right. I mean, the internet back in the year 2000, and still today to a certain extent, was as a Wild West. So I can't imagine what that must have felt like. You walk in, hey, kids, I worked on this. I got paid for this. Like, this is, I worked with what I got. Yeah.
Well, I also kind of cringe when I
sure.
realized just how far off we were.
Sure.
That these guys that I was talking to, they didn't know what they were talking about. And I was saying, well, what's this and what's this? And if you look closely at the art, it seems like there's white stripes on their legs, there's all kinds of things that were wrong about that piece of art. And it was really only the fact that it was just an astoundingly fun game to play that everybody loved. And so that, by that virtue, I was able to expunge some of the chaos of the fact that I got it wrong, but that's only because they. And then, if I may, for just a second, the whole mentality of that really made me mad was, but of course I should have realized it, that none of these guys realize how hard it is to get a piece of art past everybody in a company, particularly a big company, and and so I just hammered this thing out, it was like bam, bam, bam. I had never seen Mega Man 1. Nobody showed me Mega Man 1, which was hideous, but that was the nature of the game. It was, and I would have, as I mentioned, I would have 3 or 4 illustrations going at a time,
right?
And when things were really. When things were
really
crazy.
It's a job, and I totally get that.
I hate to say that I was misled, when I did Mega Man 2, and I was, but they didn't. They weren't trying to be screwed up,
Of course
they
not.
were trying to do the best.
They were doing the best they could. Absolutely.
And these things were happening very rapidly. I'd get called in, and I need this. Can you have it for me tomorrow? An illustration, and I'd say. It's going to be a little expensive,
Sure.
Maybe $4,500 instead of $3,500.
Yep.
And then I would be all day, all night, into the next day, and I'd deliver the art to them,
But you also did a bunch of other things in gaming that I had no clue until I started my research. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of the other work you've done, because I don't think people realize how many classic games you actually did artwork for. One of the big ones I saw was the Tengen Tetris. That was one of your
Tetris.
Works. Oh, that's
Tetris
amazing.
Was a great fun game. And but they knew what they wanted, and
so that was a well directed.
It was just a matter of going out and getting details on the building and everything. But about that game was that there was the Soviet Union, the developer that created that game was Russian, and this is my understanding was that the Soviet state took charge of it, and for a while there was a big question of whether it was even going to be able to be released,
Right. Yep.
And so, but that all happened after the fact, after I had created the art. But yeah, it's a great game, and it's one of my favorite pieces of art. But
yeah, it's beautiful. I love the artwork of the Russian buildings is great. And it's so simple and clean, and that gradient from that orange red to the yellow, and then it breaks into tetrads. It's awesome. I love that. And again, this is a classic game. It's we have a movie out now about Tetris, right? And that whole story. So it's very cool. I also love, and this may be just more personal for me because I'm a huge fan of video game magazines. You did I think it was the first issue of GamePro. You did.
Yeah, I did a number of pieces for GamePro. I did do the art for magazines quite a bit. Interior work for the magazine guys too.
Okay.
So there's a whole bunch of illustration that I did in that regard, and those were always fun. And that was another case where I got a call from somebody I didn't know, and they were down in San Mateo, and I went down to the location and I was walking around trying to find it. It turns out that it was they were jammed into a little store for a storefront thing because the earlier owner of the space had gone out of business, and so they grabbed it for a low price, and I began working with those guys, and we did a lot of, I don't know, I think that maybe 8 or 9 covers. And, and of course they had other really talented guys, doing covers for them.
Sure.
And then there was the PC games, and that was another magazine. And I did a couple of my favorite pieces of art, personal pieces, for their covers, and that was a lot of fun doing magazine covers and doing interior art, for the magazines that a lot of people aren't even aware of,
A lot of your work is very military focused. So, like Choplifter, Afterburner, UN Squadron, all these different types of games. Do you find your military experience helped influence the way you approach those pieces? Or were you really just trying to capture what was on screen and being shown to you?
The fact is that I've always been an airplane freak because, I was raised in the military and
Right.
And when we were stationed in Germany, those F-100s would, be screaming off the, taking off and coming in and right over where we live, the quarters that we lived in. So, yeah, I've always, and there were times in Vietnam where my job was to bring in, air support. And, I'd be talking to a guy in a little Cessna flying around, those guys all deserve 1,000 medals. So, they were directing we called them the fast movers, which were, the jets. Mm-hmm. And, these little guys in these little airplanes, the air control guy was really in danger all the time. But I'd be on I'd be on my radio telling them where I need to have ordnance delivered, and they would communicate with the fast movers, and the jets would come in and drop the napalm or whatever it was, To get back to the idea of what it looks like when you see an explosion, for instance, right? When you're in a jam and you're under fire, there's a lot of things, go through your head. But I know what it looks like when a mortar round, hits the ground and detonates, right? Or artillery, or any, I've seen it. I've been underneath it. I've been in it, and I know that these explosions that you see, are just they don't look like that at all. It's like the artist creates an idea, like yellow to red to black smoke to debris, and that's the rundown for an explosion hitting the ground near a soldier or your hero or whatever it is in the game. But the fact is that that's not what they look like. Basically, when a round goes off, it's all dirt, and there's a thud, and there's a blast, but there's no yellow, there's no red. It's just it's like at nighttime it's different. In any other case, these things are hitting around. And so I had this kind of naive idea that, I'm going to straighten all that out because I'm a vet and I know what it looks like and I've been under it, and so my explosions are going to look realistic. Well, that lasted my first illustration. You have to put
the client
explosion in there, for the viewer. You gotta, you need the yellow, you need the red.
Right.
These guys are under fire. If you just show it the way it really happens, it's...
You have to heighten it a bit. But you still have elements of your experience in there. Because, again, I'm looking at a lot of your, paintings like G-Lock, or I'm looking at Empire of Steel, which is a gorgeous illustration. I think it's beautiful. What you're seeing, you have those black outlines around, right, that really make them pop from the background. And, yeah, I could totally get how your experience would color that. That's so interesting. But at the end of the day, you're making a piece of artwork to sell a video game.
Yeah. My desire to straighten everybody out lasted only to my first, video game piece of art. Like in G-Lock, other things that I always wanted to do with the art that I was creating was to try to make it as realistic as I could, although in a very entertaining way.
Yes.
And in G-Lock, I actually went out and got what the cockpit of a fighter
That's awesome.
pilot, is faced with, and then laid that into the illustration where you're looking over the shoulder of the guy,
Yeah,
who's
it's
the
beautiful.
pilot. And,
well detailed.
So
I mean,
I always tried to be very technically oriented,
Yeah.
I mean, you're probably right.
Yeah. Definitely, there's a precision there.
Yeah. It was, I really did enjoy doing all of it. That's one of the things that I think when I do see, like I go to the Portland show, to sell prints. I create prints, and it was one of those things where they would, they would be kind of stunned about the fact that I don't know squat about playing a game. And I never learned. I never played any games.
Because as a kid, I never had access to a ton of games, right? You get them for Christmas and birthday. So your artwork, and again, I'm not sure which pieces were yours or not, but the art that you helped contribute to really helped shape a lot of kids' impression of a game, right? If I didn't get to play Space Harrier, I can get what Space Harrier is all about from your artwork on it and be excited about that game by proxy through what you've created. It was very influential.
It had a lot to do with, and I appreciate it from my heart. It means a lot to me to hear that. And when I go to the Portland show, I've probably gone to the Portland show maybe 4 or 5 times, or 3 or 4 times, and that's what I hear. People come up to me and they say, "You illustrated my youth."
Yeah.
Like they say, that was what I looked at, and I get a lot of gratification from that.
At the end of the day, after all the memes and the listicles and angry gamer dude videos about the worst box art ever made, Marc's inaccurate yet beautiful depiction of Mega Man 2 is a piece of video game history. Not many people can say they've created something everyone remembers, even if it's not as beloved as they initially would have liked. But hearing Marc talk about the many people who've shared stories of his work and how it affected them fills me with hope. Hope that the pendulum of public opinion on Marc's infamous rendering is starting to swing toward the positive. And if I've learned anything from Marc's story, it's that doing good work is its best reward, regardless of how people react in the moment. And there's a whole lot of power in just saying yes. If you would like to check out some of Marc's work, both with games and other projects, visit www.retrogameart.com. And while Marc provided me with a ton of high-quality examples of his box artwork, I can't share them publicly due to copyright rules. However, if you join my Discord, I'll have a full list of the over 150 games he produced artwork for in the episode discussion section. Review the list, do some Googling, and enjoy. Thank you so much for checking out this edition of A Gamer Looks at 40. If you haven't done so already, follow me on all the socials, check out the Discord, and do all the other things every podcast asks of you at the end of their episodes. All of your support is greatly appreciated. Thanks so much for checking out the show, and until next time, please be kind to yourselves and each other.